Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So we continue, we got cut off. And what we were saying is that, there to renew is that there's a certain amount of work that we need to do on ourselves as a collective to decolonize from what it is that has gone forward, ideas about human beings that have been put forward that are part of an ideological base which refuses to be challenged, right? It refuses to take challenge. And see, the dilemma that is before us, because we do live in a number of crises, right? We live in crises mode, but the dilemma that is before us is that if we were to use historical precedents, that the types of alliances and allegiances that people have to ideas, certain ideas that fall within this orientation that we're talking about when we start talking about the issue of white supremacy and Eurocentricity and so on and so forth. The dilemma that we face in this regard is that if we were to use historical examples and we were to place the same people that refuse to do this work, and some of them, by the way, are people, that have leadership. If we were to place those people in another time period, like for instance, apartheid society, then it will become clear that those positions that are taken are positions that support the apartheid system. We get confused because we hear the word apartheid and we don't realize that the type of orientation that we have in our society is very apartheid oriented. It's just loose on certain things that are manifested but in policy and so on and so forth. And see, you won't ever be able to deal with the situation on the ground, like for instance what we're seeing now with the Palestinians, until you begin to accept that it's not just a one group issue, it's a type of system that is in place. And so the Muslims want to talk about religious discrimination, but they don't want to talk about what underlines these types of things because, again, as we mentioned, they've taken a route in dealing with these types of problems, which is not getting at the core of the issue. So, for instance, the problem that goes on in France is being characterized as the issue of just secularism, but we're not acknowledging that the French themselves were not universalists when it came to the issue of human rights. And the proof of that historically is that when they talked about the whole issue of the French Revolution and the values that were put forward, they never included the colonies, they never included the Haitians. Actually, the push towards universal human rights first came from the Haitians. It didn't come from the French. It didn't come from the Europeans, because the Europeans didn't classify everyone to be human. As a matter of fact, for a long period of time, even women were not considered to be on par in human dignity with men. And so this is a dilemma that we face, that we don't really understand how to unpack Western thought as a reality. But any type of Islamic scholarship, which is not putting in the work to understand what it is that Islam is saying to the time period in the now, and how it is that these ideas that are floating around ideologically that are generated not in light of the teachings of revelation or the teachings of a form of reason which affirms human dignity for all. When we don't acknowledge that we have to do work and there's problems with these types of ideas that are floating around socially, legally, culturally, psychologically, then we just support, in essence, teachings which go against the very principles, concepts, and values that we say we believe in the Quran. So in one instance, we're saying that in the Quran, we believe that all human beings have their origin in being created by the divine, and that all human beings are brothers and sisters in humanity, and that all human beings have been bestowed with dignity by God, that no one can take away that dignity, And we say that Islam itself, one of the objectives of Islam is the preservation of human dignity and the upholding of human dignity and the cultivation and the extension of human dignity and the affirmation of human dignity. But then we go and we affirm a system ideologically which goes against all of those teachings, which is, the whole issue of white supremacy and Eurocentricity enshrined to negate anybody from having any space on the level of civilization. And it goes deep. That's why, for instance, Hegel, the philosopher, said that no one has history outside of the Europeans. He wrote off a whole continent and said that it didn't have history. And there's where you begin to see anti-blackness and you begin to see the tiered system. And Hegel, people like Hegel and Nietzsche, they prefigured the Nazi ideology from manifesting itself. And these were, praised, still studied till today, European philosophers. Hegel, which was a supporter of the Third Reich of Nazi Germany, is one of the greatest philosophers celebrated. Not great to me, but I'm saying within the society, within the civilization. He's noted as being a great philosopher. Kant, a number of philosophers, they were extremely racist in their orientation. And so as we are holding up certain aspects of European civilization, the very aspects that are being held up without any criticism or scrutiny or an examination or taking a task or reorientation or rehabilitation, whatever you want to say from any of those categories, it's just supporting the whole system ideologically that justifies what we see when it comes to the dehumanization of others. That's the dilemma, people. And so when we have someone that we see on record with receipts make statements that are continuously anti-black on moments that have been spread out through history, and then you're uplifting Eurocentric culture as being the epitome of civilization and understanding and this and that, yeah, you may not openly say that you agree, with white supremacy, but that is, هذه عين المشكلة. And this comes up, it's part of the problem. And that's why we say that, the tasks that are before the European American leadership, Muslim leadership, is a series of issues, which is the reconstruction of certain realities for European American Muslims. Because we're coming out of a culture that dominated other cultures. Nobody's culture is at a point where there is no necessity for rehabilitation and reorientation and so on and so forth. And it's not an issue like the conservatives like to say, well, he's playing the victim card. No. These are mechanisms which are used to stifle the reality of the discourse, which is calling for reorientation, a decolonization. That's just, where we're at with that. The idea that you can just bang out the concept that if someone is complaining, about oppression as it takes place, that they, are, in essence, playing the victim card. That's a serious dilemma. That's a serious dilemma when we begin to have that type of mindset. It's because the best metaphor for that is like the rapist blaming the person raped for the fact that that person got raped. You see what I'm saying? And so if the person raped begins to talk about their issues, then what happens? You know what I'm saying? What happens in that situation? Then they're called upon as pulling the victim card, the victimization card. It's a massive dilemma. It's a massive dilemma that we face in that regard. And many have bought into that because intellectually, they're not independent. Intellectually, what they're doing is they're depending upon the intellectuals that are generating and producing ideas in the society which do nothing but support the system as it is. And that's why we have a segment of the population that is going with people like Jordan Peterson and them, and they're, just mouthpieces for the order as it is. I would like to hear them take to account of the fact, this is just a manifestation of similar what Trump has said. Our ancestors tamed a continent. That's what he said. Our ancestors tamed the continent. The idea there is that there was nothing wrong with coming in and stealing and robbing. And that's the same ideology now, which says, well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with going into Palestinian land and taking their land. We were here first, and we have right to it because we claim it, because we said it. That's the dilemma that we're in, people. And so any sort of Muslim leadership which supports that type of concept, of not calling into question the reality of Eurocentricity and white supremacy and constantly making anti-black statements, you know what I'm saying, is white supremacy. You're supporting the system in that regard. That what is your corrective? You understand that you're using to address the fact that we have a system before us that's race-based. Go in there, get a Morning Star, the patties. And and get a thing of eggs, please. That's the dilemma that we face. And I'm ending on that note. You understand what I'm saying? But the issue is more complicated than what many face from the angle of understanding. Because it takes, and I mentioned this in other forums, it takes quite a degree of study to unpack what type of ideological reality and orientation that we're living in. Because things are not always manifest as they are. And you have to learn how to do that interdisciplinary work to be able to come to a point to identify the issues as they are. When you go and you study medicine and you see the orientation towards the human body, then you begin to understand that, no, this is an ideological position that is being taken in medicine that separates the mind from the body, that separates diet from illness. These are ideological positions, people. You understand what I'm saying? That looks at nature as an object, right? These are ideological positions, people. That looks at the human being as an individual, disconnected from the world, from context, disembodied. These are ideological positions. And so people like to think that, the system of racial classification and all that just went away overnight. It didn't go away. When I was like 16, 17 years old, I would go to the library and still find books that classified people of African descent like animals. In the 80s, in Philadelphia itself, when I grew up in Philadelphia, people of African descent and people that were indigenous were being burnt out of neighborhoods. As a matter of fact, we have what took place during that time period. We have a whole neighborhood that was burnt out, the Move neighborhood. And Frank Rizzo was notorious for the type of racism and so on and so forth that he put forward. And so, we have a lot of people that want to kind of play this mental washing game where they wash part of our memory as to what is the case, and they make us think that there's a barrier between times when there's no barrier. Time in itself has no barrier. The past and the present are connected to each other. And so when we have to explain history properly in order to be able to move forward. And so those people that are talking, the reality of this situation is that many that are talking, they don't have the tools to be able to move forward. And it's not the burden of responsibility on us that suffer the types of oppressions that we suffer to explain and cater and educate people that want to be on the forefront and the mouthpiece of intellectuality and reason and understanding and fight us on issues that it is that we're living in the flesh. It's not the youth that was picked up off of the street because of profiling. It's not his or her responsibility to explain to you that an injustice has taken place. It's your responsibility to understand where it is that violations take place. But that person that has experienced that injustice perpetuated on him, or not being read their Miranda, or being shot on the spot, not given excuses, there's no discretionary power of the law which is exercised to give that person enough space so that they may survive on that encounter with the police. It's not their responsibility to come and justify to you that how things are not, how things are not just. And this is the problem that we have. You know what I'm saying? This is the problem that we have. You know, that we have a society which upholds the status quo, and not only upholds the status quo, fights for it, and then also tries to sit there and play the role of advocate for a system which doesn't deserve advocacy. If you understood the formation and the foundation and the creation and the justification for the reality that we're living in, then you would know that we're living on stolen land. You would know that there was transatlantic slavery. You would know that there's laws that have been put in place to justify the dehumanization of other human beings. And so when we have people that live in this society and they constantly support that reality in the Muslim community itself, it's a dilemma, because it goes against the reality of what it is that Islam is teaching. And so we that understand this reality and understand Islamic scholarship, we shouldn't even be having these discussions. We shouldn't be having these discussions. We shouldn't. This is not mental gymnastics. When we're talking about genocide, when we're talking about couturicide, when we're talking about the oppression of people. It's sick to be in a situation where people are suffering what they're suffering, and there's another group of people that sits by as spectators, and they're expecting an intellectual spectacle to describe what it is that is going on. What more do you want? Do you want the impact and the effect of blood of the moment to hit your face so that you acknowledge it as a reality? Because obviously the intellectual contact between your brain and the context of the situation and the time period that we're living in is not sufficient for you so that your intellectual ability grasps the truth of the moment. You sit back and you deny what it is that you're seeing under the premise, well, sense perception can confuse us. Well, we can reinterpret realities in different ways. That's not what the lived, embodied experience of those who are suffering the oppressions is. That's you, because you're in a position of privilege and detached from human suffering and haven't come to a point where you have enough empathy to use even the Jewish philosopher Levinas, where you can recognize the humanity of others. And so it becomes a problem in the situation that, for instance, you know, we can sit here, we could talk about the Holocaust which took place in Nazi Germany and the inhumane position of the Nazis in failing to recognize the face of the other, which brings a moral imperative to treat that person like a human being when you acknowledge the face, the identity of the person. And this all goes back even in religious thought that the face of people, you know, is an identity. It shows the uniqueness of the human being. So if they can't even acknowledge in your face, make eye contact with you so that you recognize you're dealing with the human being, you know, it's a problem. In this type of situation, we're dealing with people that say you have to justify to me that you're a human being. That was the situation of the person of African descent in this country. So, you know, we can keep going on and on with that type of stuff. But the dilemma is that when Muslims get caught up in this, what they do is they derail the liberation experience of Islam, and they flip Islam into an opiate of the masses, which becomes a justification of the same system of oppression, and it just becomes an extension of religious thought, which has been used to justify dehumanization of people, the taking of life, the taking of wealth, yeah, and the continued perpetuation of systems of oppression. And we can't let that happen. Because if we're saying that Islam is the last revelation and we allow Islam to fall into that, then what begins to be the case is that then religion itself as a prophetic imperative is a failed project. And then at that point in time, people will say God is a failed project. And so if the religious community claims to have a real commitment to God, then they have to have a commitment to the human being. That's the reality at the end of the day. And if you're claiming to have a commitment to the human being, then you have to acknowledge that we're living in a time period where the realities within the last few hundred years, it has been such that human beings from different tribal orientations have at times been left out of the definition of being a human being. And so if we don't see that this is a society which has done that to a significant portion of the population, which hasn't acknowledged their full humanity, and we don't see that there's a need to correct that, and we're trying to say, well, that was something before the 60s, it's gone, then you're part of the problem. I'm ending on that note. Assalamu alaikum.